Is this working? Okay. So we're going to begin our final round, finally, for the 2013 Canadian or Albertan debate provincials. Yeah, I'll try not to. So anyhow, thank you all for being here. This is our final round, and we are pleased to recognize that we are in fact very on time right now. So thank you all for being here. On side proposition, we have our first speaker, Alex Rodrigues, and our second speaker, Graham Climbing, both from Bishop Carroll. Round of applause, please. And on side opposition, we have our first speaker, Mr. Ben Lukenchuk, and our second speaker, Chris Salavov. And they are from Weber Academy. So, round of applause. We are debating the research topic, that is, this House supports free immigration. And without further ado, I would like to invite our first proposition speaker, Mr. Alex Rodrigues, who will deliver a constructive speech for no more than 8 minutes.
Alright, I want to say thanks to Henry for that beautiful introduction. And we're going to get right into it here with the topic that this House supports free immigration. And we also have proposition. Basically, we want to tell you one thing, and that is that free immigration is the most efficient form of immigration. That if we have jobs and we have people, we have to take the people and put them where the jobs are. And that's basically the essence of our case today on side proposition. So what am I going to do for you today? First, I'm going to introduce the definitions. I'm going to show what we're going to be doing in this debate, and then I'm going to move on to our first two constructive points, which are about developed nations and then developing nations. Then my partner Graham is going to talk about our third and final point about the global political impacts of this resolution. But let's start off with finding out what we're talking about today. We're going to define this House as the world, and when we're talking about supporting free immigration, we're talking about supporting a system similar to what we already have in the EU, known as the Schengen Treaty, where basically any individual is allowed to go to any country, so long as, obviously, we're still allowed to restrict them from moving if they're criminals or if they're going to be a danger to society. But other than that, we have basically free and completely open immigration. Now, what we're going to be saying also is that because this is a supporting resolution, obviously it's not realistic for us to expect North Korea or some of the more backwards countries to adopt this. However, we support it, and we would, in the same way that we support trade, support institutions, support treaties, and support the growth of free immigration in our society because it's beneficial. So now let's get into our constructive material, starting off with developed nations. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be an interesting pillar because I'll bet a lot of you came into this room with a lot of misconceptions about what immigration does to developed nations. And a lot of politicians like to say one thing which really doesn't make sense. And we're going to show the economic analysis and the real facts about why it is that immigration is actually good for developed nations. So let's start off with the idea of growing the market. Ladies and gentlemen, the first fallacy that you'll hear is that there's a limited number of jobs and immigrants are taking jobs. And that's blatantly untrue, ladies and gentlemen, because for a simple fact, the job market is not a limited factor. There's not 100 jobs and that's it. The more people that show up, the more demand there is for jobs, the more demand there is for goods, and thus the labor market grows itself. The labor market is one of the few things that has a very little limit, because the more people there are, the more people we need things for. So it's simply a basic fallacy, the idea that there's a limited number of jobs. Instead, more people allow us to have a greater amount of specialization. More immigration allows us to get people to go wherever they're most useful. As we can see in the EU, people, if they're Germans who are highly skilled in architecture, and there's a great need of architects in Italy, then they can go there and they can be more useful than they would have been in their home country. We see more development. And then what we also see is quite simply a more successful society. Now, here's a great way to think about it. When we have immigrants coming in, they really come in and they don't supplement the workers we have. They actually complement them. If you look at the kind of workers that we have in Western society, largely we have a group of people that are a lot of very middle-class people, a few highly skilled, say PhDs, and a few very unskilled high school dropouts. So we sort of make a diamond shape with a little bit of high skill, a little bit of low skill, and a lot of people in the middle. Whereas immigrants tend to be the opposite. we have a very large number of people who are very highly skilled, coming here because they understand the opportunity, they have the ability. A lot of people who are very low skilled, who are hoping to get a better life than what they had back home, and not so many people in the middle. And so you have these two groups that instead of replacing each other, actually complement each other, and help to support each other, and develop a more functional economy. Wouldn't you agree?
I wouldn't, because when you introduce a lot of people in the low and higher end, you undermine the middle class, which is essential to creating a strong and diverse economy.
That was a great statement, but it didn't really have any evidence. What I'm going to show you in a second is that we're actually not going to be doing that at all. So now, I showed you that they're complementing, it's going to be beneficial. Let's look at some other examples. If, as many people would argue, adding more people to the labor market leads to unemployment or lower wages, then theoretically, when we had massive additions to the labor market, for example, when women joined the workforce, 1950s, 1960s, when we saw the baby boomers join the workforce, theoretically, now we ought to have a huge amount of unemployment. But when we look around today, does everyone have no job? No. The labor market grew. It adapted. And what we saw is that the labor market actually became larger and more diverse, and we had a stronger economy as a result. So there's some great logic, and let's look finally at what is the statistical evidence. Now there's this great economist at Harvard known as George Borjas, who he said, I'm going to weigh all the ideas. And he showed us two things. Firstly, immigrants do not significantly decrease the wages of anyone in America. And secondly, that more than $20 billion is actually added to the American economy every year as a direct result of immigration. Ladies and gentlemen, developed nations benefit, one, from being able to put people where they're most needed, and two, from having a larger, more diverse workforce. So open immigration is good for developed nations. Now let's talk about developing nations. Ladies and gentlemen, developing nations benefit from a couple of different things. Firstly, something called wage convergence, then foreign training, and finally, social benefits or aid. So let's start off by talking about wage convergence. What we see is that in the third world, people are often able to be exploited by large companies because there are very few opportunities. If you have no opportunity except for a 25-cent-a-day job, it's very easy for someone to offer you a 25-cent-a-day job and you have to take it. However, once we open up borders, once we allow people to move around, simply the fact that they could leave their country, they could find work other places and have a plethora of opportunities available to people in the third world, creates something called wage convergence, where their wages rise because there are better opportunities elsewhere and the employers don't want them to leave. So we're going to have increased wages in the third world. Then we talk about foreign training. If it's easier for immigrants to go abroad, to go to foreign universities, to learn and develop their experience and skills in the first world, and then they can return home with that skill set. And we actually see that this is a very popular choice coming to, for example, American universities. And we end up benefiting these countries by adding more skilled laborers because of foreign training. And then finally, let's talk about foreign aid. So ladies and gentlemen, we like to support the third world. Here in the first world, we like to say that we support foreign aid. And we have lots of institutions that do that, for example, the World Bank. What we see is that our current system of foreign aid doesn't work very well. The World Bank has been loaning to the third world for over 60 years. And in that time, sub-Saharan Africa has had a negative growth rate. That doesn't mean that they've been growing slowly. It means they've actually been getting poorer, despite our aid efforts. What we see on side proposition is that the governments in these countries are largely very corrupt and are very unable to utilize aid effectively. Now, what's a more effective solution to that? We would say something known as remittances and simply taking the people from ineffective countries into effectively governed countries. Let's talk about, firstly, moving people. The New York Times tells us that 8 of 10 Haitians who are above the poverty line, 8 of 10 Haitian-born people, they don't live in Haiti anymore. They live in America. Because the best way to get Haitians out of poverty is not to send more aid to that country, but to allow Haitians to come to America and get a better life there. We see that we don't care if the bit of land is poor, but if we can take those people and give them a better life, that's aid that works. And even better, these people then do something called remittances, where often they'll send money back to their family at home. And these are even more effective because they're directly connecting to the community. They're not going through government bureaucracy, they're going straight to family members and friends, and they can really see the impact and they know where to send the support. So we see that the foreign aid is actually more effective when it's moving through a system that uses people instead of the ineffective governments of the third world. Ladies and gentlemen, the developing nations benefit from wage convergence, more skill, and foreign aid in the form of remittances. It's good for developed nations, it's good for developing nations, and it's good for the world. Thank you.